Alright, students, so obviously I had to step out of the room for a few minutes for an interview, but for the school, so I wanted to record these notes for you to follow along, and I really want you to take your own notes. So I'm not giving you these PowerPoints because I want you to kind of. No, I'll take that back. I'm going to give you some blanks to go along with this, but I'm going to add some information and I'm going to write on the slides some extra information that I want you to add to your slides as well. And note that you have a quiz next class on properties of water and this information. So it's really important that you take good notes now. You can study those good notes, and whatever questions you have, you ask when I come back into class in a few minutes, okay? So let's go ahead and get started. And so the first thing that I want to just say real quick is, let me get my pen going here, is that, and I want you to add this because you have a blank slide as slide number 2, that there are some major types of transport. And what we're thinking about with transport is really of how things get across cell membranes. But there are several types of transport. I'm going to go ahead and add that. Across the cell membrane. Now, note that I'm not writing this for myself. I'm writing this for you, so I want you to copy this down. So, there are two major types. Passive transport and active transport. And that's how we would qualify them. But there are several different types of passive transport. So we'll come back and fill those in. And in fact, this is active transport is the main type that we're going to talk about, but there are two smaller subsets that we'll be talking about in the near future. Today, what we're focusing on is this passive transport and the three types of passive transport. So, I hope that makes sense, and what we'll do is come back and fill in these three. So, again, talking about the two major types, there's passive transport and there's active transport. If you think about what these two mean, and if you look at these two pictures, passive transport simply is movement across the cell membrane. Here you see the cell membrane, right? So this area here on either side is the cell membrane. I hope that you can recognize the phospholipid bilayer. So here is one phospholipid and it's got some tails coming off of it. We've got a protein here. And see there's a pore that things are passing through, and same over here. Here's a protein in this purple. I'm just coloring over in green. But the key difference here is that passive transport does not use ATP, whereas active transport does. And if you remember, ATP is a form of energy. So active requires energy, passive does not. So the type of learning you're doing right now by listening to me talk to you is called passive learning, because you're not putting in much energy. But if you were to be discovering this on your own or using it in a lab, for example, then that might be active learning because you're putting some more energy in. We're going to talk about another key difference that you see based on the direction of the arrows. In passive transport, the things are moving up, and then things in active transport are moving down. That really makes no difference. It's really about where all these extra particles are. So we're going to break that down in just a minute. So this is the definition of passive transport. This is what we just talked about. The cell moves substances through the cell membrane without using energy. And that's the key, is without using energy. But let me qualify that by saying without using extra energy, because every system already has energy in it. And that's what makes those molecules bounce around against each other. But there are three major types: diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. And if you need to pause if I'm going too fast, please feel free to pause or rewind. I'm going to go back to this slide and go ahead and write these in. So the first type is diffusion, which we alluded to last class, or 2 classes ago really. The second type is osmosis, and the third kind is facilitated diffusion. Okay, so this whole section of passive transfer in these 3 types are what you need to know for class next time. Okay, so let's talk about the first type, diffusion. So I'm going to label this as A, because this is one of the 3 types of passive transport. This is where molecules move from high concentration to low concentration. So they move from where there's, I'm going to add a little note here, lots of stuff, or it's highly packed or very dense, to lower concentrations, or where there's very little stuff. So if you look at this picture here, notice that what I'm pointing to now is the cell membrane, and these circles, these spheres, are the molecules, the stuff that we're talking about. And assuming that they can go through the membrane easily, this is a little bit of an over-exaggeration of the size of these molecules, but on this side on the left, we can see that it's more concentrated. There's a higher concentration, so I'm going to write that. We've got higher, I can spell higher concentration on the left of the membrane. On the other side, we have a lower concentration. And what that means is that according to diffusion, if the molecules can go through the membrane, they will move from where there's lots of stuff to where there's not lots of stuff. So they will move into the cell. And the reason that they're moving, remember I said this is a form of passive transfer, so it does not require extra energy. But why are they moving? And basically, the molecules are bumping into each other. So because they're not at 0 Kelvin, I hope you remember that from middle school, but basically because they have some energy, they're bumping into each other, and when they bump into each other, they spread out. And if they can cross the membrane, they do, and they will continue to bump into each other and move across this membrane until they reach equilibrium, which is simply the idea that they're even on either side of the membrane. And that's diffusion. So sometimes diffusion can happen across a membrane, like a cell membrane, but it doesn't have to. For example, if someone were to light a scented candle on one side of the room, the people who are closer to that candle will smell it before other people, and there's no membrane for that. Those chemicals that we're smelling to move through, they were just simply bumping into each other and spreading out across the room, or diffusing across the room. Okay, so this random movement scatters particles of solute and solvent. So if this is a new word and this is a new word, let's define them. Solute are things that dissolve into a solution, and a solvent is the thing that dissolves the solute. So if we're talking about salt water, the salt is the solute, the water is the solvent, because the water dissolves the salt until they're evenly mixed. Another example is food coloring into a beaker of water. So this is kind of hard to see, but here's the food coloring right here. Put a drop. Well, I can't draw a drop. What am I doing? We put a drop in, and it starts to spread out. And if we waited and waited and waited and waited and waited, we would see that these molecules would have bumped into each other and spread out. So there are a couple of things that we could do to speed up. So what can we do to speed up the diffusion rate, or how fast the molecules are spreading out? I think it's kind of interesting to think about, and we'll answer that in just a moment. So, particles will move until they're evenly distributed throughout, which is another way of saying equilibrium. But then they continue, this is the key, they continue to move randomly. So even though they're evenly spaced on either side of the membrane, that doesn't mean they're not still moving and bumping into each other. And so this is the term that you want to know. It's dynamic equilibrium. That's a key word. And this is just the continuous movement of these molecules, but there's no change. So as one, if we've got our membrane, our semi-permeable membrane, and things are able to move back and forth, they will continue to bounce around and spread out to find equilibrium. But that doesn't mean that the molecules on this side, even if they're evenly spaced out on either side, doesn't mean that they will, once they're even, they stop moving across the membrane. Even if they're equal, one of these molecules might move over, but now we've got more on this side than this side, so these will bump into each other more often, and one will move back over. May not be the same one, it'll be a different one. And that's what's called dynamic equilibrium. It's staying stable, but it's the molecules themselves are changing their position. That's what dynamic means, changing. Alright, so there are some factors that affect the rate of diffusion. We've got the concentration gradient, we've got a selectively permeable membrane, and temperature. So a gradient is how different are the two sides in terms of concentration. So how densely packed. Selectively permeable, some things can get through, some things can't. So this is real, diffusion is affected by this, because if some things can get through and spread out, then great, they will spread out. But if they can't, then they're not going to be able to reach equilibrium on either side of the membrane. And temperature is one, because we're increasing the movement of molecules. So if we add temperature, they move and bump into each other faster. And in doing so, they will spread out faster. But there is one more method, and I'm not going to tell you what it is. I'm asking you if you can think about it. What is it? What's the other movement, the other type of thing that can speed up the rate of diffusion? Okay, so here's a little bit on the concentration gradient. This is the difference in concentration. So we can see on this side, on the left side, we've got lots of water and not a lot of solute. And on the other side, on the right side, we've got not a lot of water and a lot of solute. But notice that the solute's really big, so that's not going to be able to go through the membrane so easily. But water can spread out. So there's high concentration of water on the left and low concentration of water on the right. So water moves to the right. That's what this arrow is telling us. So low concentration, this is a high water concentration, low water concentration. Which, when we say there's lots of water, there's a lot more water, and that also means that there's a low concentration of solute. Remember, this is the solute. And on the right, we've got the opposite. We've got high concentration of solute. So let's say that this solute could move through the cell membrane easily, then the arrow for the solute would go to the left. But because it's so large, it can't diffuse through this cell membrane, and because it can't, it's stuck here and can't spread out. So only water can move. So diffusion occurs along a concentration gradient until it reaches dynamic equilibrium. And I hope that makes sense to you now. The reason that the membrane is selectively permeable is because it only lets nonpolar things through easily. And that's simply because of this hydrophobic region in the cell membrane. The fatty acid tails, remember, hydrophobic means nonpolar and doesn't like water. It doesn't like water, which is a polar molecule. And so some things can pass directly through the membrane, so nonpolar things like fat, but some polar things can sometimes. Let me see where I'm, okay. But they have to be small. So water can pass through, let's say sometimes. Sometimes it needs help getting through. But things that are charged, that have charges, like pluses or minuses, can't get through because those interact with water, and the fatty acid tails don't like these pluses and minuses, so they repel them. Or really large molecules like glucose. Remember, glucose is C6H12O6. That's a lot of atoms. It's a really big molecule. Alright, so osmosis is simply the diffusion. This is 2. This is the second form of passive transport. So diffusion of water through a selectively permeable membrane from an area of high water concentration to an area of low water concentration. And I think that's important to remember. It's just when there's lots of water moving to where there's not a lot of water across the membrane. So if we're looking at this image, again, we've got the blue dots as water and the orange as a solute. And if only water is able to move, then water is going to move from where there's high water on the left, lot more water, to the right where there's not a lot of water. So there will be more water over on the right than on the left. Right now there's more water on the left than the right, and then it'll balance out for the amount of water. So there will be equal amounts of water on the left and the right. But remember, the right has a lot more solute. And the solute can't move, so that means that there will be more solute on the right than on the left, and there will be equal amounts of water. So overall, there's more stuff on the right than the left in the end. And that's what this picture is showing, is that if water is the only thing able to move, then after you allow a solution to move through a semi-permeable membrane, you'll have 2 separate sides with different water levels. Which is weird to think about, that in one container you could have 2 different water levels, but it's true. Alright, and then the last type, I don't know why the last type of passive transport is facilitated diffusion. And facilitated just means that it received help, or that it was helped. If I facilitate your learning, I'm helping your learning. That's what this is. There's diffusion that's being helped by protein channels. Remember that our phospholipid bilayer is part of the fluid mosaic model. We've got phospholipids, we've got proteins, we've got cholesterol. So here is our cell membrane. And here's a protein. And sometimes if these molecules are polar or large, they need a protein to provide a channel or a pore to let things through them. And what we call these proteins are transport proteins or channel proteins sometimes. Okay? I think that's the last slide, yeah. So this video link, if you remind me, I'll show you, but it's just a recap of what I told you. So let me go back to the second slide. So passive transport is a form that does not use energy. there are three types: diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. So diffusion is just movement of molecules from high concentration to low across the membrane. There's several factors that influence this, but it's trying to reach equilibrium, and you want to make sure you understand what dynamic equilibrium is. Osmosis is the diffusion of water, and facilitated diffusion is diffusion with the help of proteins. But again, it does not use energy. Okay? And so that's what you need to make sure you understand, in addition to the properties of water, for Monday's quiz. Okay?